Welcome to a journey through the Middle Ages, but not the version with passive princesses and silent saints. Today, we're diving into the lives of women who broke rules, bent history, and refused to stay where society put them. Unpredictable, brilliant, inconvenient, and unforgettable. Hit subscribe, get comfortable, and enjoy the ride. Forget everything you know about medieval princesses. Eleanor wasn't singing with birds and waiting for a prince. She was born like an earthquake, wine in one hand, scepter in the other, and a personality so sharp it could cut through chainmail. It's around 1122. Welcome to Aquitaine, the lush, sun-drenched south of France, where the vineyards are more plentiful than churches and poets are treated better than priests. Her father? William X, Duke of Aquitaine. For medieval standards, basically a liberal arts professor. He loved music, poetry, hawking, and the radical idea that his daughter should be educated. Eleanor had tutors, scribes, court troubadours, and they all figured it out early. This girl wasn't just clever, she was dangerously intelligent. While other noble kids were learning to kneel, she was reading Latin, quoting saints, and analyzing diplomatic moves like a pint-sized Machiavelli in a silk dress. At 7, she could recite prayers. At 9, she was arguing about morality. By 12, she was eavesdropping on council meetings and offering advice, which was sometimes actually taken. She didn't just study culture, she was the culture. Aquitaine wasn't the stiff, gray northern court of Paris. This was the birthplace of courtly love, of music, and bold women. And Eleanor? She soaked it up like wine in a velvet cloak. She didn't grow up to be a lady-in-waiting. She was already waiting for the crown. And then, tragedy with a plot twist. In 1137, Eleanor's father dies. Suddenly, no brothers, no uncles strong enough to take charge, just her. And instead of stashing her in a convent like most families would, her father does something unthinkable. He names her his heir. A girl. In full. Not a duchess by marriage, not a placeholder, but the actual ruler of Aquitaine, owner of one of the richest, most powerful territories in all of France, at 15. With vassals, soldiers, castles, and land-hungry kings suddenly very interested in her future. One of them, King Louis VI of France, gets there first. On his deathbed, he arranges for his son, Louis the Younger, to marry Eleanor. Political jackpot. Eleanor brings nearly half of modern France as dowry. And so, the deal is struck. The problem? Nobody asked her. She's 15. Sharp as a dagger, speaks Latin, knows how to ride, read, and rule. And her prize? A husband who would have preferred a monastery. Literally. Louis VII wasn't supposed to be king. His older brother died unexpectedly, and Louis, originally headed for the church, was shoved onto the throne still clutching a prayer book. Their marriage was the holy union of flame and holy water. She wanted pageantry, strategy, courtly games. He wanted silence, confession, and probably a novena before touching her hand. Romance? Think spiritual retreat, but with awkward dinners. While Eleanor was trying to spark a renaissance, Louis was just trying not to offend God. She danced. He frowned. She challenged dukes. He apologized to monks. At one point, you could practically hear her sighing through the stained glass. And then, the Crusades. Louis, overcome with guilt for accidentally torching a church full of people, true story, decides to atone by going to the Holy Land. And of course, he brings his wife, in armor. Eleanor rides out with her own contingent, 300 people, including her ladies, knights, and a wardrobe that screamed battle glam. She's not just attending, she's commanding. And medieval Europe loses its collective mind. A queen on horseback, giving orders, unacceptable. Or, depending on your source, irresistible. Cue the scandal. Rumors of an affair with her cousin Raymond of Toulouse start swirling like a holy dust storm. Were they true? Who knows? But Louis? Furious, jealous, and suddenly very devout about annulment. When they return, sunburned, humiliated, and probably not speaking, the cracks become chasms. In 1152, Eleanor does the unthinkable. She files for divorce. In Catholic France? In the 12th century. Official reason? Consanguinity. They were too closely related. Which, fun fact, didn't seem to matter during 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters. She walks away. No tears, no shame. Still Duchess. Still powerful. Still terrifying to every bishop from Bordeaux to Reims. And then, just 8 weeks later, she marries someone else, Henry Plantagenet. 18 years old, almost a decade younger than her. Ambitious. Clever. Dangerous. Sound familiar? The French court chokes on its own wine. England prepares for an empire. And Eleanor? She's just getting started. So Eleanor walks out of one royal marriage, dusts off her crown, and 8 weeks later, marries Henry Plantagenet. He's 18. She's nearly 30. It's not just a romantic move, it's a masterstroke. Why? Because this young man is about to become King of England. With Eleanor's lands in Aquitaine and Henry's inheritance across Normandy, Anjou, and soon all of England, their combined territory becomes larger than the French king's own domain. It's the kind of alliance that makes maps nervous. In 1154, Henry becomes King Henry II of England, and Eleanor, once again, a queen. But this time, not a passive one. If France tried to tame her, England would learn what happens when you hand a tiger the scepter. At first, things go well. Very well. They're young, brilliant, wildly attractive, according to some 12th century fanfiction, and politically lethal. Eleanor gives birth to not 1, not 2, but 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland, the future disaster who would inspire the legend of Robin Hood. She rules Aquitaine, literally. While Henry runs around conquering Ireland and yelling at Thomas Becket, Eleanor governs her duchy like a boss, building alliances, hosting courts, and nurturing a culture of poetry, power, and diplomacy. She's not queen in the corner. She's queen with the pen and the army. But then comes the crack. Henry, surprise, has a wandering eye, and worse, a wandering sense of ego. He starts treating Eleanor less like an equal, more like a trophy with a really annoying political opinion. He sleeps around. He ignores her advice. And finally, he pushes her aside from governance. So Eleanor does what any highly intelligent, politically connected queen would do. She plots a rebellion against her own husband, using their sons. Welcome to 1173. Eleanor encourages her sons, including Richard and the eternally disappointed Henry the Younger, to rise up against their father. And for a brief, glorious moment, it works. The Plantagenet family officially becomes a full-blown HBO miniseries, complete with castles on fire and betrayals over dinner. But Henry strikes back. He crushes the rebellion. And Eleanor? He locks her up. Yes, the most powerful woman in Western Europe is thrown into house arrest in a cold stone castle. And she stays there for 16 years. No court, no visitors, just guards, walls, and a king who apparently thought that imprisoning a woman who birthed half of Europe would end well. Spoiler, it wouldn't. But Eleanor doesn't break. She waits. She watches. And when Henry finally dies in 1189, guess who's released from captivity with a crown still metaphorically stapled to her head? Queen Eleanor, now in her 60s, out of her cage, and ready to run the empire again. This time as the mother of the new king, Richard the Lionheart. Henry is dead. Long live Richard. And guess who's back? After 16 years in royal lockdown, Eleanor rides out like a thunderstorm on horseback. She's nearly 70 in medieval years. That's basically immortal. And instead of retiring to a convent like a good medieval widow, she returns to the throne room with a to-do list and zero patience. Her son, Richard the Lionheart, is now king. Sounds great, right? Except he's barely in England. Literally, he's off on crusade, battling Saracens, flexing in chainmail, and doing whatever else bored warrior kings do when they don't feel like governing. So who runs the country? Eleanor. Again. Of course. She becomes regent, acting queen, de facto ruler of England and its sprawling empire, while Richard plays knight in the Middle East. She collects taxes. She manages castles. She calms nobles. She prevents civil war. She does it all without breaking a sweat. And all while wearing widow's black and dealing with chronic medieval arthritis. And just when things couldn't get worse, they do. Richard gets captured on his way home from the Crusades. Yes, the King of England is now a very expensive hostage in a German castle. Cue Eleanor, 70-something, furious, and unstoppable. She starts fundraising, personally. She rides across the country demanding taxes, confiscating church gold, shaking down nobles like a royal mob boss in a wimple. The ransom? 150,000 marks. A staggering fortune. That's like demanding $1 billion in pennies. And guess what? She raises it. Every last coin. England groans. Priests faint. Eleanor pays. Richard is freed. But peace doesn't last long. Richard dies in 1199 from a crossbow bolt. And now the throne passes to her least favorite son, John. The same John who will eventually lose Normandy, sign the Magna Carta, and get turned into a cartoon lion in Disney's Robin Hood. Even then, Eleanor doesn't quit. She helps broker his accession, manages diplomacy with France, and continues traveling Europe into her 80s, arranging royal marriages like a medieval Tinder overlord. When she finally retreats to a nunnery, it's not surrender. It's retirement. She dies in 1204, 80-plus years old. In a world where most women didn't survive childbirth, she outlived kings, popes, sons, enemies, and time itself. She dies in 1204. In a cold stone convent at Fontevraud, surrounded not by kings, but by silence. By then, she had outlived 2 husbands, 8 children, 5 monarchs, and nearly an entire century of war and scandal. The chroniclers called her a woman of great beauty and boundless ambition. The church called her dangerous. The poets called her a muse. History? It forgot her for a while, because women who command, love fiercely, rebel publicly, and refuse to vanish quietly tend to be written in the margins. But Eleanor was never marginal. She shaped the politics of England and France with her bare hands. She raised kings. She rebelled against them. She crossed mountains in winter to arrange treaties. She funded the rescue of a crusader king. She ruled without a throne. She led without permission. And in the end, she proved that power has no gender, only will. While Eleanor was commanding armies and playing political chess with kings, another woman was making waves, quieter, but no less revolutionary. She wore no jewels, no sword, no crown, just a nun's habit, a quill, and visions so intense they shook the pillars of the church. Where Eleanor ruled empires, this woman spoke with angels. Where Eleanor mastered politics, she mastered medicine, music, and mysticism. Hildegard of Bingen, get ready! The next voice you'll hear won't be from the battlefield. It will be from the very edge of the divine. From the moment she picked up that quill, Hildegard of Bingen stopped being just a nun. She became a prophet, a theologian, a medical expert, a composer, a poet, and a divine PR channel with better branding than half the bishops in Europe. She was no longer hiding. The voices that once whispered in the dark were now echoing through stone halls, and soon, all the way to the Pope himself. Let's be clear, Hildegard didn't just have visions. She published them, like a medieval sci-fi author on divine steroids. Her first book, Scivias, short for Know the Ways of the Lord, wasn't just a pious diary. It was cosmic architecture. Fiery spheres, glowing mandalas, giant female figures made of light. If it sounds like a DMT trip in Latin, that's because it kinda was. And then, the church didn't ban her. They blessed her. Because instead of saying, I, Hildegard, think this, she said, this came from God. I'm just the scribe. Argue with him. Genius. The clergy couldn't dismiss her as a heretic because she wasn't defying doctrine. She was illuminating it with actual visions and musical scores and herbal recipes for humoral imbalance and female melancholy, which, let's be honest, probably helped more than most priests ever did. Soon she was writing letters to emperors, abbots, and yes, the Pope. And not "Dear Your Holiness, I am humble" letters. We're talking spiritual roasting on parchment. Like when she told one archbishop his clergy were basically limp noodles of virtue. Or when she warned Frederick Barbarossa, the actual Holy Roman Emperor, that he was acting like a spoiled child in a crown and should probably rethink his war plans or face divine smiting. And they listened. Because when a 60-year-old nun with visions, Latin fluency, and international fan mail tells you God is pissed, you don't argue. You repent. But Hildegard wasn't just the voice of heaven. She was also the woman you'd want around when your spleen hurt, your soul ached, and the local priest told you to just confess more. Because Hildegard believed the body and spirit were one system. And when one broke down, the other followed. Before there was self-care, there was Hildegard's Handbook for Cosmic Wellness, a mix of theology, botany, and no-nonsense advice like, if you're sad, sing. If you're bloated, eat fennel. If you feel demonic, maybe skip the wine. While bishops were arguing about sin, and barons were arguing about taxes, Hildegard was busy curing your existential dread with soup. She believed that the human being wasn't just a sack of bones waiting for divine judgment. It was a delicate, fiery ecosystem, full of energy, mood, and mystical vibes. Basically, your humors had to be in harmony, or you'd get sick, physically or spiritually. Her medicine was part science, part theology, part vibes check. Example? Feeling sluggish and sinful? Try fennel tea, a hot bath, and maybe chant a psalm or two. Got mysterious stomach demons? That's just blocked viriditas, the greening power of life. Take some herbs, walk in a garden, and pray with feeling. Yes, viriditas. Her word, her concept. A kind of divine chlorophyll flowing through all things that grow, heal, and live. Honestly, if she were alive today, she'd be on a TED Talk stage with plants behind her and 2 million views. She wrote 2 massive works on natural healing. Physica, a book of plants, stones, and animal remedies and cause et cure. A book of causes and cures for everything from gout to lust. Oh, yes. She wrote about sex, in detail. She described the experience of male and female pleasure during intercourse, medically, metaphysically, and with enough clarity to make several monks clutch their rosaries. Why? Because understanding the body meant understanding the soul, and ignoring either? That was the real sin. Hildegard's view of medicine was revolutionary. She didn't separate mind from body, or body from spirit. A sick person needed food, prayer, community, and sometimes a really good herbal salve and a stern talk with God. But even Hildegard had limits. And when the church crossed one of hers, she pushed back. Hard. Because for all her obedience, her letters, her Latin, and her visions, there was still one thing she refused to do: hand over the dead body of a man the church called a heretic, because she believed he died in peace. And when they punished her, she didn't cry, she composed. Let's set the scene. Hildegard is now in her 80s. She's famous, respected, revered. She's written visions, books, music, medicine, and letters to emperors. Basically, she's the Beyoncé of Benedictine Europe, but with a better herbal garden. And then one day, a dying man arrives at her convent. He's excommunicated. The church says he's a heretic. Hildegard? She sees something else, a broken soul seeking peace. So she does what any healer would do. She lets him die there, in sanctuary, and she buries him, on consecrated ground, like a human being. The local church authorities absolutely lose it. How dare she give a proper burial to someone outside of God's grace? How dare she, a woman, decide what's holy ground? They demand she dig him up, remove the body, erase his peace. Hildegard refuses, point blank. No theatrics, just, he confessed, he repented. He died in God's light. I buried him and I will not disturb him. Boom! So what does the church do? They ban her. Not from writing, not from praying, from singing. That's right. The woman who believed music was divine breath, who composed soaring chants and celestial harmonies, was banned from letting her convent sing. No mass music, no liturgical chants. Silence, like exiling a bird for flying. And Hildegard? She doesn't beg, she doesn't cry. She writes back. A 4,000-word theological mic drop, explaining why denying music was like denying the very voice of God. Eventually, the ban is lifted. Because, really, how do you silence someone who talks to angels and copy edits scripture? Hildegard dies shortly after, in peace, in her convent, surrounded by the sounds of the sacred. Hildegard heard voices and wrote them into music. But what happens when a girl hears voices and decides to change the course of a war? No convent, no crown, no noble birth. Just a teenager with a haircut, a flag, and a very loud message from heaven. The men laughed. The church panicked. And the English? They started digging a stake. Forget every painting you've ever seen of Joan of Arc. Forget the marble statues, the soft-eyed saints in stained glass, the weeping icons in cathedrals. Joan didn't glow. She burned, fast, fierce, and far too bright for the world that tried to hold her. She was born in 1412 in a village called Domremy, so small and muddy it barely qualified as a dot on the kingdom's map. Her father was a farmer. Her mother kept the house. They owned no land, no title, and no illusions of grandeur. France was at war, again, and they were simply trying to survive. Joan was supposed to be no one, just another village girl who would marry young, raise children, and die in the same dirt she was born in. She wasn't taught to read. She never held a book. She probably never traveled more than 10 miles from home. But something was different. From an early age, Joan was strange. Not in the way that worried people, but in the way that made them whisper. She prayed more than necessary. She confessed constantly. She fasted when she didn't have to. She cried during Mass for reasons she couldn't explain. And then, sometime around the age of 13, she heard a voice. Not a feeling, not a dream, a voice. Clear, commanding, real. At first, she said nothing. Who would believe her? She was a peasant, a girl, a nobody. But the voice came again, and again. And then others came with it. St. Michael, St. Catherine, Saint Margaret. They didn't comfort her. They didn't bless her. They gave her orders. Save France. Crown the king. Lead the army. Go. She didn't laugh. She didn't doubt. She didn't ask, why me? She said, yes. And that's when everything changed. It wasn't just that Joan heard voices, it was that she listened, and worse, that she acted. In a time when women couldn't preach, couldn't lead, and certainly couldn't command armies, she stepped forward and said, God speaks to me. Not to the bishop, not to the king, to me. The voices weren't vague. They weren't dreams or feelings or sudden flashes of inspiration. Joan described them like visitors, beings of light speaking in words she remembered, issuing commands she couldn't ignore. Saint Michael, she said, appeared to her first, in shining armor, with a voice like thunder and wings that glowed. He didn't offer her comfort. He gave her a mission. And then came Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, virgin martyrs who told her to be brave, to stay pure, to never give in to fear. When she described them, she included everything: what they wore, how they spoke, how they smelled. She said they brought the scent of paradise. This wasn't mystical poetry. This was testimony, direct, immediate, physical. Theologians were baffled. Some suspected demons, others feared prophecy. A few even believed her. But the scariest thing wasn't the voices themselves. It was that she obeyed them. She cut her hair. She dressed in male clothes. She left home. She rode straight into enemy territory to speak to the Dauphin, the uncrowned Charles VII, and told him what no general, no priest, no royal advisor had dared say. You are meant to be king, and I am meant to get you there. He tested her, sent her to theologians, made her wait for weeks, and yet, something about her changed the air. She never claimed to act on her own. Every word, every movement, every decision, she credited to the voices, and that made her unstoppable. Because how do you reason with someone who believes they are carrying out the will of heaven? Not ambition, not madness, certainty. That was Joan's true weapon, and it terrified everyone. Forget the image of bloodthirsty warriors bashing heads with maces. Joan wasn't that. She never swung a sword. She didn't fight hand to hand. She didn't need to. What she brought to the battlefield wasn't violence. It was conviction. Bright, wild, and blinding. And it worked better than any blade ever could. When Joan arrived at the front, the French army was a disaster. Scattered, exhausted, demoralized to the point of collapse. The English controlled vast swaths of land. The Dauphin, the uncrowned King Charles VII, still hadn't proved he could do anything other than brood and delegate. And here comes Joan, 17, a peasant girl, in men's armor, riding a white horse and carrying a banner that looked like it belonged in a cathedral, not a battlefield. On it, the name of Jesus, 2 angels, and a golden fleur-de-lis. No blood, no crest, no threat. Just purity, visible for miles. The generals laughed. The commanders doubted. The priests held their breath. Then she opened her mouth and told them what God had told her. Orléans would be saved. Charles would be crowned. France would rise, if they followed her. And against all reason, they did. Orléans had been under siege for months. Supplies were low, morale lower. The English expected it to fall any day. Joan said no. She rode into the city like a comet. The people flooded the streets to see her. They called her the Maid. She prayed. She rallied. She told the commanders to attack. They hesitated. She didn't. On May 7th, 1429, Joan led the assault on Les Tourelles, a key English fortress. Not from behind, not from the back lines. She was at the front, flag in hand, shouting, praying, standing on the ladder as arrows flew past. One arrow struck her, straight through the shoulder. She fell, pulled the arrow out herself, prayed, and came back before the generals finished arguing what to do next. That evening, the English abandoned their position. The siege was broken. A 17-year-old girl in a white suit of armor had done what entire armies couldn't do for months. She wasn't a commander. She was a catalyst. Joan didn't draft strategy. She didn't map supply lines. She didn't even command troops in the formal sense. What she did was ignite belief. She made cowardly men brave again. She made desperate cities open their gates. She made soldiers confess, fast, pray, and believe. Sometimes for the first time in years. She forbade swearing. She banned prostitutes from camp. She told them to treat war like a holy act. It wasn't fear she used to command them. It was something worse for their enemies. Hope. One knight said she fought like a flame that didn't burn. Another said her presence turned boys into lions. The English! They didn't call her mad. They called her a witch, because there was no other explanation for a girl who could win. Joan wasn't done. After Orléans, she pressed Charles to ride north, straight through enemy territory, to Reims, the ancient city of coronation. He hesitated. She insisted. He obeyed. They marched. Towns opened their gates. No blood was shed. The wind had changed. And on July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France. And beside him, in the cathedral, stood Joan. Not a noble, not a general, not a man. Just a teenage girl in full armor, holding the banner that had flown in every battle, every prayer, every miracle. She had no title, no estate, no future promised to her. And yet, she gave France back its crown and asked for nothing in return. Joan had done everything they asked. She broke the siege of Orléans. She marched a king to his coronation. She turned the tide of a war that had been bleeding for nearly a century. And she did it without land, without rank, without a sword of her own. Just a banner, a vision, and a will sharper than any blade on the battlefield. And yet, when she was captured, there was no rescue, no army sent, no royal envoy with a scroll and seal, no secret negotiation behind stained glass doors. The king she had crowned with her own hands, Charles VII, quietly turned his back and vanished into the velvet of his throne. It was May 1430. The town of Compiègne was under siege. Joan rode out to help defend it, just as she had done for so many towns before. Only this time the gates closed behind her. She was thrown from her horse and surrounded, not by English soldiers, but by Burgundians, allies of the English, Frenchmen wearing the wrong loyalties like rented coats. She was handed over like a criminal, a prisoner of war, though she had never killed anyone. Sold for 10,000 livres, the cost of a good war horse or a fancy hunting lodge. A national heroine, traded like common property. She was taken to Rouen, chained in a tower, locked away like a relic they didn't know how to destroy. And from there, the real war began, not with armies, but with paper, robes, and questions designed to trap, twist, and unravel her. This wasn't justice, it was theater. The church agreed to conduct a trial, not to understand her, but to erase her. The English wanted a heretic, not a martyr. They needed her legacy to burn with her body, so no one would ever follow another girl in armor. They assembled 70 clerics. Not a single one was sympathetic. Most had ties to the English crown. The charges were absurd even by medieval standards. Wearing men's clothing, claiming to hear divine voices, riding into battle without male permission, daring to act as though God might speak to someone outside the hierarchy. Joan had no lawyer, no advocates, no French witnesses. They grilled her day after day, trying to confuse her, to make her contradict herself, to get her to stumble. And yet she held. For a 19-year-old girl who had grown up among sheep and mud, her answers were clearer, wiser, and sharper than the questions of men twice her age. They asked, "Are you in God's grace?" A question designed to destroy her. To say yes would be pride. To say no would be guilt. Joan didn't blink. "If I am not," she said, may God place me there. If I am, may he keep me there." They had nothing. But they didn't need something. They needed a reason. Any reason. So they reached for the easiest one, her clothes. She had promised, under threat of torture, to stop dressing as a man. She agreed. They gave her a dress. And then, days later, she was found again in male clothing, which, legally, was relapse. Spiritually, it was rebellion. Punishable. Final. But what they didn't say, what would come out much later, was that they had taken her dress, left her without anything to wear. Male clothes were all she had. And perhaps deeper than that, she was tired of pretending, tired of playing by the rules of men who had already decided her fate. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led into the marketplace of Rouen. She asked for a cross. A soldier broke 2 sticks and tied them together. A sympathetic cleric fetched one from the cathedral and held it high. They tied her to the stake. She looked up, not down. She called out for Jesus. And then they lit the fire. She burned. Once, then twice, then a third time, just to make sure there was nothing left to bury, nothing to venerate, nothing to remember. Her ashes were scattered in the sand, and for a moment, it worked. The banner was gone. The girl was gone. The silence crept in, but only for a while. So you've just met Joan, the teenage girl who defied armies and was burned for hearing voices. But what if I told you she wasn't the only woman in the Middle Ages who told kings what to do? Let's rewind a few centuries and head south to the sun-drenched hills of Italy. Because before Joan ever strapped on armor, there was another woman already rewriting the rules of power. Her name was Matilda of Tuscany, and when men argued about who got to rule Europe, she built castles, raised armies, and made emperors kneel. Literally. Matilda of Tuscany wasn't born to be married off at 12, wear braids, and produce sons in exchange for political peace. She was born to inherit half of Italy and make kings regret underestimating her. Her family name? Canossa. If that already sounds like a fortress, it's because it practically was. Matilda was born in 1046 to Boniface III, Margrave of Tuscany, one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in the Holy Roman Empire. Her mother, Beatrice of Lorraine, was no decorative duchess either. She had her own titles, her own lands, and most importantly, her own strategy. This wasn't a typical noble family. This was a dynastic powerhouse, a political machine with castles, monasteries, private armies, and connections that reached from the Alps to Rome. From a young age, Matilda was treated not as an accessory, but as a potential heir. Her education wasn't just embroidery and prayers. It was canon law, Roman history, scripture, military logistics, and yes, how to negotiate with angry men in mitres and chainmail. And then came the tragedy that changed everything. Her father, Boniface, was assassinated when she was just 6. Her only brother, Frederick, died under mysterious circumstances a few years later. That left Matilda and her mother, 2 women, in charge of one of the most valuable territories in Europe. Most would expect them to retreat. Instead, they took control. Beatrice assumed regency, remarried, strategically, and raised her daughter not to wait for a husband, but to govern like a prince. By the time she was a teenager, Matilda could quote St. Augustine and command mercenaries in the same breath. She presided over vassals. She issued edicts. She trained with weapons. And she watched. She watched how men spoke to each other, how power moved between city and cathedral, and most of all, how quickly it could be taken if you weren't ready to hold it. Let's talk land. By the time Matilda came of age, she controlled a political corridor from the Alps to Rome. That included key roads, mountain passes, trade routes, and fortified strongholds, dozens of them, that any army moving between northern and southern Europe would need to pass through. In short, if the Pope wanted to flee north, or the Emperor wanted to push south, they needed her permission. She didn't just hold land, she held leverage. Strategic, topographical, military leverage. The kind that made emperors twitch and popes send letters in gold leaf. And she wasn't just holding it, she was preparing to defend it. Matilda didn't rule from behind silk curtains. She visited her lands. She inspected fortresses. She made alliances, built bridges, funded abbeys, and paid for walls. Thick walls, with high towers and loyal guards. Because she knew what was coming. The empire was fracturing. The Pope and the Emperor were heading toward a fight that would tear Christendom in half. And when it came, Matilda would not be neutral. She would pick a side. She would raise an army. And she would use every stone, scroll, and sword in her arsenal to shape the outcome. It was supposed to be a question of theology. Who gets to crown bishops, the Pope or the Emperor? Just a minor clerical issue. Some paperwork, a little liturgical protocol. Except it wasn't. It turned into one of the most brutal, personal, and symbolically loaded power struggles in medieval history. And caught in the middle, standing at the center of it all was a woman named Matilda of Tuscany. Now let's be clear, Matilda didn't stumble into this war. She wasn't some pious widow dragged into politics by her confessor. She walked into it in armor, with an army, with more land than most monarchs, and more strategy than most generals. And she picked a side. The year is 1076. Emperor Henry IV has just been excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII for the holy crime of being extremely full of himself. The Pope says only the Church can appoint bishops. Henry says, "I'm the Emperor. I'll appoint whoever I want. And by the way, you're fired." The Pope replies by cutting Henry off from the sacraments, the Church, and, oh yes, eternal salvation. And who do you think steps in to protect the Pope from the inevitable imperial tantrum? Who opens her fortresses, raises troops, and turns her mountain castles into anti-Henry resistance bases? Exactly. Matilda. She doesn't just say, "I support the Church." She bankrolls it, arms it, shelters it. She brings Pope Gregory into her castle, Canossa, like a queen inviting her bishop to hide out during the apocalypse. And then comes the moment. The scene so iconic it's still taught in textbooks, drawn on cathedral walls and referenced by politicians who've never read a page of canon law. Henry IV walks to Canossa. And by walks, we don't mean he knocks on the door and says, "Can we talk?" We mean he trudges through the Alps. In winter, barefoot, in a wool shirt, in a blizzard, to beg forgiveness. Let's pause. The most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, is excommunicated, abandoned by his nobles, and forced to perform the medieval equivalent of a public apology tour outside Matilda's castle. He waits 3 days, in the snow. While inside, Matilda and Pope Gregory sit by the fire. And here's what gets skipped in most history classes. She's not just watching, she's directing. This isn't some passive abbess sipping soup in the corner. Matilda is negotiating, meditating, deciding exactly how long Henry should suffer. Some sources say Gregory wanted to forgive him sooner, and Matilda advised against it. Others say she was the one who finally convinced the Pope to open the gates. Either way, she wasn't a footnote. She was the frame. And when those gates finally did open, when Henry was granted audience and absolution, the world changed. Because it saw an emperor kneel, not just before a pope, but on land governed by a woman. What happened next? Well, Henry did what insecure men with crowns often do after public humiliation. He went full scorched earth. The absolution was barely dry on the parchment before he rallied his forces, returned to Italy with fire in his eyes, and marched straight into Rome. He set up an anti-pope, crowned himself emperor, declared victory. And Matilda? She just kept going. She held the castles. She fought back. She funded reformist monks and exiled cardinals. She turned her personal army into the Vatican's unofficial defense force. She wrote letters, marched troops, hosted councils, commissioned fortifications, and held the line for decades. Canossa wasn't the end of anything. It was the proof that Matilda could take two of the most powerful men in Europe, put them on opposite sides of a castle gate, and hold both of them in check, without a crown, without a husband, and without ever raising her voice. The emperor begged, the pope forgave, but the world remembered her. And really, who wouldn't? Want to see what happens when she trades diplomacy for open war? Because next, she stops forgiving and starts breaking sieges. Most noblewomen of the 11th century were busy with embroidery, relics, and making sure the servants weren't stealing the silver. Matilda of Tuscany? She was busy designing fortress networks, inspecting supply lines, and instructing her captains on how to hold a bridge during an imperial siege. Because after Canossa, it became painfully clear to everyone, especially Henry IV, that Matilda wasn't going to fade politely into her prayer book. No, she doubled down. With the Pope temporarily kicked out of Rome, and Henry basking in his new self-coronation, most people in Matilda's position might have folded. Said a few Latin apologies, negotiated some land back, married a politically acceptable man, and disappeared into safe irrelevance. Matilda didn't fold. She fortified. While Henry declared victory from a throne propped up by an anti-pope, Matilda was building castles, real ones, with garrisons, siege defenses, and clear lines of retreat. Her lands, stretching from Lombardy to Lazio, became a military maze of don't even try it. And if you did try, she had armies. Yes, actual armies. Trained, paid, loyal, not mercenary trash hired last minute. These were troops who knew they weren't fighting for some absent duke or bored bishop. They were fighting for her, a countess who rode into camp in armor and expected results. She wasn't just a symbolic leader. She commanded troops in person. Sources from the time, mostly men who were shocked she existed, describe her leading campaigns, giving battlefield orders, and coordinating multi-front defenses like she was born with a sword in one hand and a map in the other. And she was effective. Her tactics were clever. She used terrain, feudal alliances, and delay strategies like a general trained by chess masters. When Henry tried to march through her territories again, he didn't just meet resistance. He met a logistical nightmare wrapped in Tuscan hills and divine defiance. Meanwhile, she didn't forget the politics. While fighting a literal imperial invasion, she still managed to support church reformers, endow monasteries, fund theological scholars, and continue her correspondence with Rome like nothing was on fire, all while maintaining control over one of the most complicated stretches of land in Europe, a corridor of passage between north and south, religious and secular, emperor and pope. And in case anyone still thought she needed a man in charge, history offers a polite chuckle. She was married, once, briefly, to Godfrey of Lorraine, a powerful ally and, by all accounts, completely irrelevant in her actual life. It was a political match, not a love story. He brought soldiers, she brought everything else. And after a few years, he died. Or vanished. Or maybe she simply blinked and he was gone. No children, no drama, no loss of power. Matilda never remarried, never passed off her title, never handed the reins to a cousin, a regent, or a hopeful nephew. She ruled alone for over 30 years. In a century where women weren't even allowed to act as legal witnesses in many regions, she wrote laws, enforced justice, raised armies, and told emperors where they could shove their banners. So when chroniclers from the 11th and 12th centuries mention Matilda with reverence and often fear, they're not exaggerating. They had simply never seen a woman like her. And frankly, Neither has history since. Want to know how she ended it all? With one final move that would enrage emperors and make the Vatican weep tears of joy? Stay tuned. Because next, Matilda leaves everything to God. Literally. By the time Matilda of Tuscany entered her 60s, most of her political enemies had either died, converted, or quietly developed a deep spiritual allergy to the word canossa. She had survived emperors, popes, rebellions, sieges, and at least 3 full cycles of men insisting she'd be replaced any year now. She wasn't replaced. She outlasted them. But power, especially the kind that burns as brightly as hers, doesn't go quietly. And Matilda had one more move to play. It was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Emperor Henry IV was dead. His son Henry V was on the throne, and surprise, the apple had not fallen far from the aggressively imperial tree. Henry V was young, ambitious, and desperate to reclaim everything his father had lost, including Tuscany. Matilda saw it coming. And so, before the empire could sharpen its knives, she handed over everything she had: lands, castles, titles, taxes, bridges, hills, and holy roads, to the Pope. Not to her heirs, she had none. Not to the emperor. To God officially, legally, and irrevocably, in the person of the Holy See. This was not a casual gesture. This was a provocation dressed as a pious act. Because by donating her entire estate to the papacy, Matilda had effectively cut the empire off from 1/3 of Italy, not just now, but for centuries. The emperor, understandably, went ballistic. But there was little he could do. The paperwork was in order. The signatures were sealed. The church had just inherited an empire, and Matilda had made sure it was all tied up with canon law, divine justification, and layers of legal defense thicker than the walls of Canossa. And then, she died, quietly, in July of 1115. No drama, no fall from grace, no final siege, just an extraordinary life, concluded on her terms. But even in death, she refused to go unnoticed. Because in 1645, yes, 5 centuries later, Pope Urban VIII had her remains moved to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Yes, that's St. Peter's, where popes are buried, where saints are honored, where the bones of emperors would never dare lie. Her tomb sits in the Vatican to this day, the only woman buried there. A marble monument sculpted by Bernini, with angels and trumpets, and an inscription that practically says, "She built fortresses. She gave popes a kingdom. She made emperors wait in the snow. We remember." And so should we. Because Matilda wasn't a medieval exception. She was a medieval warning. A woman who didn't need a crown to rule, a man to govern, or an army to prove a point. Even though she had all 3. She didn't just play the game, she rewrote it. And then she handed the rulebook to the church and walked out the door. With dignity, with legacy, with history staring after her, whispering, "Wait, can she actually do that?" Yes. Yes, she could. And she did. And there you have it. 4 women, 4 storms. A queen who ruled more than kings. Eleanor of Aquitaine. A nun who wrote music with angels and roasted emperors by letter. Hildegard of Bingen. A teenage girl in armor who heard voices, crowned a king, and walked into fire. Joan of Arc. And a countess who made emperors kneel, built fortresses, and donated half of Italy to God. Matilda of Tuscany. Not one of them waited for permission. They weren't exceptions. They were corrections. They reminded the world, again and again, that power doesn't ask for a beard or a blessing. It just shows up, with vision, voice, fire, or fortress. And we've only just begun. In our next lecture, We'll meet more women who redefined the medieval world, from scholars to spies, mystics to monarchs, and, as usual, refused to stay in the margins where history tried to keep them. If this story made you think, feel, or quietly fist pump in public transport, don't forget to follow, like, or share this episode. Your click is a vote for more forgotten voices being finally, unapologetically heard. Thanks for listening, and see you next time in the Middle Ages. Just the part they didn't teach you in school.